If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. The fog tonight is thick and smells of salt and ruin. It presses against the coastal towns like a damp shroud, heavy enough that you can hear the deep, resonant groan of the navigational buoys out on the Columbia River bar, a sound that always feels less like a warning and more like a massive, submerged beast drawing a slow, deliberate breath. This sound, that low, vibrating hum echoing through the static of the void, is the first thing I hear every time I close my eyes. It started in 1989, and it has never truly stopped. Check the lock on your window, just in case. They say the fog is harmless, but around here, fog is just the veil dropping. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It's good to know where the shadows are tonight. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. I was 24, attached to the Astoria Marine Patrol, navigating the teeth of the Columbia River bar, the place sailors call the graveyard of the Pacific. I grew up on the smell of diesel and cold steel, understanding that the river here wasn't just water. It was violence, a liquid engine of chaos where the full force of the continent's largest river fights the full, unforgiving power of the Pacific Ocean. It chews up boats and spits out splinters. It was November 4th, 1989. The patrol shift was routine until it wasn't. The bar had been quiet for days, a deceptive calm that always made the old-timers nervous. I was running slow near the Clatsop Spit, where the North Jetty used to guide the channel, but now mostly serves as a resting place for rusted dredge parts and drowned hopes. It was mile marker 0, the entry point. That night, I saw her. She was standing on the very edge of the concrete pier, maybe 30 yards from the first set of submerged pilings. A young woman, late 20s, dressed in a thick, dark coat. She wasn't fishing, wasn't sightseeing. She was simply standing, facing the open expanse where the fog met the massive, churning current. I cut the engines and drifted, calling out through the loudspeaker, "Ma'am, you need to back away from the edge. Tide's changing." She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge the lights or the sound. It was the complete lack of reaction that chilled me more than the November air. It wasn't defiance. It was submission. I grabbed the binoculars. Her hands were pressed flat against the dark fabric of her coat, rigid at her sides. She stood there for maybe 90 seconds, motionless, a silhouette carved out of the pervasive gloom. Then, without fanfare, without throwing her arms up or collapsing, with the serene, dreadful dignity of someone meeting a scheduled appointment, she stepped off the edge. The water temperature was maybe 40 degrees. Hypothermia is measured in minutes here. I was moving the second she disappeared, throttling the patrol boat into the dangerous shallows, shining the powerful spotlight onto the spot where she vanished. There was no splash, no scream, no thrashing against the current. The river simply accepted her. We dragged the area for hours. We pulled Coast Guard assets. Detective Trent Guidry from Clatsop County Sheriff's Office showed up, shaking his head, writing it off quickly. Just another lost soul, Thorn. The bar claims them every year. But this felt different. I've seen suicides here, desperate, messy things full of last-second regrets and struggles. This was different. It was an offering. The victim was identified as Clara Vance, a librarian from Seaside. No note, no known depressive episodes, just vanished into the black water near marker 0. The case went cold immediately, filed under possible suicide/accidental drowning. I couldn't shake the image of her calm, vertical descent. It was the first time I felt that the river wasn't just swallowing her, it was inhaling. The true dread set in 3 months later. March 1990. Another one. A fisherman named O'Malley, known locally for being boisterous and stubbornly alive. He parked his truck in the exact same spot near the spit entrance and walked into the dark current. Again, no struggle, no body recovered. Then came the spring. April, a young university student visiting family. May, an elderly man known for his robust health. Every single one of them, near that same treacherous bend of the North Jetty. By late June, when the seventh person disappeared, a local waitress named Phelan, the silence in Astoria wasn't just the fog. It was the town holding its breath. 7 people in 8 months, all lost near marker zero. It's the current, Elias. It drags them out into the Pacific, Guidry insisted, wiping the chalk dust off his hands at the precinct board. But I'm a Marine Patrol officer. Grounding fact, I know the hydrodynamics of the bar better than I know my own living room. Even with the powerful outgoing tide, bodies usually surface, usually catch on the jetties, or wash up further down the coast. The absence of remains was statistically impossible, unless the river was doing something impossibly specific. I started running names through the county records, chasing a hunch I couldn't articulate. I looked past the usual suspects, gambling debts, domestic disputes, depression, and focused purely on geography and lineage. I cross-referenced the names of the 7 victims, Vance, O'Malley, Phelan, for others. I felt a cold wire twist in my gut when I started checking Ancestry. I had to use archaic archives, digging into census data and old maritime logs. But the pattern, once illuminated, was terrifyingly precise. The 7 lost souls were all, without exception, direct descendants of men and women who were aboard the Tidal Grasp, a coastal steamer that wrecked spectacularly on the bar in 1894. It was one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in the region, claiming over 100 lives in a single, freezing night. These weren't random victims. The river wasn't claiming, it was collecting. I began to develop a terrifying speculative concept. The water wasn't a natural boundary. It was a hungry, conscious membrane. The deep maws the local indigenous tribes used to whisper about. It wasn't the chaos of the bar that was the danger. The bar was just the visible manifestation of something ancient and malevolent beneath. And that thing was waking up, following a very old, very specific manifest. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. I kept looking over my shoulder, even in my tiny apartment overlooking the bay. The river, a mile wide, felt like it was pressing against the window pane. Then came the final, devastating confirmation. I typed my own name into the ancestor database. Thorne. Silas Thorne. Ships made aboard the Tidal Grasp, 1894. Listed among the irrecoverably lost. I was related to one of the dead. I was a direct descendant. And I had been patrolling that spot every night the river took one of my kindred. I wasn't an investigator anymore. I was part of the equation. I realized the 7 disappearances were not the end of the chain. They were the preamble. They were clearing the stage for the main act. The cold current was pulling me in. The revelation about my lineage, Silas Thorne, the lost ship's mate, hit me with the force of an unexpected wave. The cold dread solidified into a heavy certainty. I was next on the list. But why? Why this precise, morbid historical echo? Why was the river suddenly interested in the grandchildren of the drowned? I couldn't go to Guidry or the patrol chief. Telling them that the spate of drownings was a selective, century-old historical cleansing targeting the descendants of a specific shipwreck would get me locked in a room with padded walls and a very kind doctor. I had to look into the past, into the places where the official records break down and the folklore takes over. There was only one person who would understand the language the river was speaking, my grandmother, Alara Thorne. Alara lived in a small, damp house perched high above the cliffs of the bar. She was Creole, like my father's side of the family, and her knowledge was built on generations of maritime observation, superstition, and whispered warnings. She didn't read the official weather reports. She read the color of the foam and the mood of the deep tide. When I showed her the list of the 7 victims and their connection to the Tidal Grasp, she didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted, as if she had been waiting for this exact conversation for 50 years. She led me to a dusty back room where she kept archaic journals and maritime maps, maps that weren't for navigation but for commemoration. On a brittle, yellow diagram of the Columbia River bar, she traced a finger over marker 0. "It is not Silas they are claiming, Elias." Her voice was like dry leaves scraping pavement. "It is the contract they are enforcing. Your great-great-grandfather, Silas, did not simply drown. He became a sentinel." She told me about the night of the 1894 wreck. The storm was cataclysmic, a meteorological aberration that shouldn't have happened. The tidal grasp was pulled into the shallows and pulverized. The official story says the loss was total and tragic. Alara told me the truth was far worse. As the steamer broke up, Silas, along with a few others, tried desperately to swim to shore. But the river was shifting, groaning, revealing something immense and unnatural in the churned-up abyss beneath the channel floor. Grounding fact: geologists know that the sudden shift in the continental shelf off Oregon creates vast, deep trenches, known in oceanography as abyssal plains, where light never reaches and pressure is crushing. The bar sits right on the fault line. Alara described this trench not as a geological phenomenon, but as a vast, sentient hunger. "When the ship shattered, it opened the abyss," Alara whispered, gripping my wrist with surprisingly fierce strength. "Something slept there, older than the coastline, older than the tribes. It is a thing of cold, cosmic void, Elias, and it wants the light, the air, the world above the waves." Silas Thorne and the others who witnessed the abyss were given a choice, or perhaps they made a desperate, panicked speculative concept, a blood bargain. To save the coastline from the ancient entity's awakening, they agreed to become the first anchors, the drowned army. They surrendered their souls and their flesh to the river, becoming guardians, binding the entity with their voluntary descent. The river accepted the offering and contained the horror. But guardianship is never free. It is a curse passed down the line. Alara explained that every few decades, when the entity stirs beneath the riverbed, she called it the Kphalos, the current guardians weaken. A new sacrifice is required to reinforce the bonds. A descendant must willingly enter the water to replace the fallen sentinel. The river had been calling Silas's lineage and the others who made the pact since the 1894 wreck. My grandfather, Thomas Thorne, lost in 1955 near this same spot, had been the last replacement. The Coast Guard called it a boating accident during a squall. Alara confirmed Thomas had simply walked off his small skiff in perfect calm, just as the 7 recent victims had done. He had voluntarily gone to reinforce the barrier, continuing the grim duty started by Silas. Now it was my turn. The 7 recent victims were the buffer, the warnings, the small payments the river extracted while waiting for the next true sentinel. Me. "They are singing to you now, Elias," Alara said, handing me a small, heavy piece of polished jet. An amulet she said had been blessed by the first people of the coast. "Do you hear the river?" I realized I did. Over the drone of the foghorns and the static in my own mind, I could hear a sound that was less noise and more a fundamental vibration. It was a mournful, collective hum, like thousands of bass strings being plucked far below the surface. I started hallucinating, not just minor visions, but full sensory shifts. I would be driving my patrol boat across a familiar wave face, and suddenly the water would turn perfectly transparent, revealing not mud and rock, but a churning, lightless void, filled with the ghostly, dark shapes of men standing guard in the silent, freezing water. I saw my grandfather, Thomas, looking up at me, his eyes wide, his uniform dissolved, his hand extended, not in welcome, but in weary warning. I tried to ignore it, to treat it like fatigue. I couldn't. One afternoon, standing on the North Jetty, watching the tide surge, the phantom music swelled. It sounded like a choir singing in perfect, crystalline despair. I felt an overwhelming, magnetic pull to the edge. It was the deepest, most profound sense of belonging I had ever known. The cold, dark water suddenly seemed warmer, safer, and infinitely more meaningful than the dry land. I took 3 steps toward the edge before the little jet amulet burned hot against my chest. The pain snapped me out of the trance. I backed away, sweating, fighting the visceral urge to surrender. Reflective thought. We think fear is external, a shadow, a monster, a gun. But the worst fear is internal. The seductive lure of annihilation. The moment your own soul argues eloquently for its own extinction, convincing you that the true peace lies beneath the waves. Alara's warnings were stark. I had to choose. Either I accept the curse, walk into the bar, and become the new sentinel, ensuring the Kthalos remains dormant for another generation. Or I resist, let the curse fail, and risk the full, catastrophic awakening of the ancient entity, swallowing the coastline and everyone I knew. The anniversary of the 1894 wreck was fast approaching. August 5th. It was the date of the greatest storm, the date the first pact was sealed. And the river was singing louder every single day. The weeks leading up to the anniversary, August 5th, were a continuous, waking nightmare. Sleep offered no respite. The phantom current of the river flowed straight through my bedroom. The collective hum of the drowned army was now a constant presence, a subliminal pressure behind my temples. My investigation had stalled at the supernatural wall, but my physical investigation, the one I had to conduct in the cold, wet archives of the real world, was picking up speed. I needed allies who could anchor me to reality while I fought the current of madness. I contacted Dr. Sarah Mills, an LSU professor of maritime anthropology who happened to be conducting research on early Pacific Northwest shipping patterns at the Astoria Historical Society. She was skeptical but open-minded, drawn initially by the bizarre clustering of the 1894 descendants among the missing persons reports. I couldn't tell her about the Kthalos or the blood bargain. Instead, I focused on the historical anomaly. Dr. Mills, I believe these disappearances are part of a shared historical trauma, maybe a specific kind of folklore manifesting physically. They all involve descendants of the tidal grasp victims, and the incidents occur at the exact same geographic point. Grounding fact, Dr. Mills provided context on how cultural trauma and mass fatality events, especially those involving water, often generate localized, intensely powerful folklore, a phenomenon known as traumatic echoes in anthropology. While she searched for psychological patterns, I was searching for the sacrificial sequence. I also met with Antoine Brossard, a local Creole musician and archivist known for keeping the old, forgotten songs of the river settlements alive. He was instantly receptive to the idea of a singing river, recognizing the cadence I described. "Ah, the chant de Ames," Antoine murmured, running his fingers over the frets of an ancient guitar. "The Song of Souls. My grandfather spoke of it. It is not music, Elias. It is the sound of deep work being done." He began composing a new piece, something mournful and robust, hoping to find a countermelody to the river's depressive pull. As the physical world provided context, the supernatural pressure intensified. The river wanted me now. The entity beneath, the Kthalos, was stirring violently, sending up massive, unnatural swells even on clear days. I was riding my patrol boat through a dense blanket of coastal fog one morning. The visibility was zero, forcing me to rely entirely on the radar and the compass. Suddenly, the radar screen went blank, filled with pure, shimmering white noise, despite no technical failure. At the same instant, the engine died. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. I was adrift in the gray ether of the bar channel. The silence was soon broken by the singing. It was deafening now, directly in my ears, amplified by the fog. It wasn't despair anymore. It was command. Come. It is time. Reinforce the wall. Then, a vision slammed into my consciousness. I was no longer on the patrol boat. I was standing in the dark, freezing water, the pressure immense, my lungs screaming. I looked around and saw them, the drowned army. They were not decaying corpses. They were perfect, waterlogged statues of men, clad in the thick, dark wool of late 19th century maritime gear. Their eyes were open, fixed on the crushing darkness below. My grandfather, Thomas, was closest to me. His face was etched with endless fatigue. Don't fight it, Elias. Thomas's voice echoed in the non-air of the hallucination. It is better here. The burden is too great above. I saw Pierre Leblanc, my summary reference, but here it's Silas Thorne, the original sentinel. He stood at the center of the formation, holding an ancient, heavy iron ballast, a literal anchor for the curse. He looked young, terrified, and utterly resolute. They were a wall of memory and sacrifice, holding back the abyss. But the wall was porous. I could see gaps in the ranks, where the 7 recent victims should have been standing. Their places were empty, and the blackness beyond was beginning to surge. In the center of the dark trench, I saw the Kthalos. It wasn't a monster with teeth or scales. It was a gravitational anomaly, a swirling, coiling mass of utter non-light, a pure absence of existence that radiated infinite cold and deafening, hungry silence. It was the absolute void trying to fold back into reality. Reflective thought. This is the ultimate trap of psychological horror, to internalize the threat so completely that salvation seems to lie only in joining the nightmare. I felt the seductive logic of sacrifice, ending the pain, fulfilling the destiny, ensuring temporary peace for others. I ripped the headset off, screaming against the singing, throwing myself against the controls of the patrol boat. The jet amulet was blazing hot against my skin, giving me just enough purchase on reality. I clawed the engine back to life. The radar flickered back into view, and the fog began to shred, revealing the mundane gray waves of the bar. I had almost drowned in the dream. My clothes were soaked in cold sweat, but the terror was real. I knew then that resisting was not enough. I was fighting a supernatural tide that demanded specific, physical action. The entity didn't want my struggle, it wanted my surrender. The anniversary was 3 days away. I was running out of time to find an alternative to the blood bargain. I had to go back into the dark. I decided I would dive into the river on the night of August 5th at Marker Zero. Not to drown, but to meet the army, to face the abyss, and somehow, to negotiate the terms of my survival, or my sacrifice. But I would not go unarmed. I carried the jet amulet, Antoine's newly composed, defiant anthem in my memory, and the history I had unearthed with Dr. Mills. If the river wanted a sentinel, I would give it one, but on my terms. The clock was ticking down to the moment of my descent. I began assembling my gear, a heavy-duty dry suit, a reliable underwater light, and a single, long rope tied to the stationary wreckage of the old jetty, my only tether to the world above. August 5th, the anniversary of the tidal grasp wreck, the night the abyss was revealed, and the night the first sentinels plunged into the cold. The air was unnaturally heavy, the tide unusually high and fast. The moon was obscured by a thick, oppressive bank of clouds, making the coastline disappear into the void. I parked my official vehicle far down the jetty access road. I didn't want the patrol boat. I needed a stationary, fixed point to dive from. I carried the heavy canvas bag containing my dry suit, compressed air tanks, and the heavy-duty submersible lamp. I told no one what I was doing, not even Alara. She would have tried to stop me, or worse, she would have tried to go in my place. I was acting as the final link in the chain, making the choice I was born to make. Grounding fact, Underwater diving psychology recognizes the intense sensory deprivation that accompanies deep-water night dives, a state known to induce profound, altered consciousness and hallucinations, even in experienced divers. I was relying on this altered state. I needed to step outside of rational thought to understand the abyss. I suited up quickly, the neoprene feeling like a second, cold skin. As I adjusted the mask, the world narrowed, focusing on the dark, churning water beneath the concrete pier of Marker Zero. The water was black ink, thick and lightless. The singing was deafening now, a pure, resonant bass thrumming against my ribs. It felt like the river was calling my specific frequency. I attached the end of the long safety line to a rusted iron mooring ring, securing the coil around my waist. This rope was purely psychological. If the Kthalos was real, no piece of rope could stop it. I took the final steps to the edge. The seductive pull was nearly overwhelming. The water didn't look like a threat. It looked like home. I had to force the muscles in my legs to lock up to keep from simply stepping off. I checked the time. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes to midnight, the traditional hour of the crossing. I took a deep breath, filled my lungs with the cold air, and recited the only piece of defiance I could muster, the lyric from Antoine's song. We remember the names, the sea does not forget. I activated the submersible lamp and jumped. The impact was brief, swallowed immediately by the water's immense density. The cold was shocking, a searing, immediate burn despite the dry suit. The darkness was total. The light beam was a narrow, sickly cone cutting through the suspended silt, illuminating nothing but particulate matter and the immediate, churning current. I swam downward, following the vague shape of the collapsing jetty foundation. The current here was legendary, a deep, powerful flow that threatened to rip the mask off my face. I fought the current, kicking hard, descending maybe 40 feet, until I reached the chaotic, submerged graveyard of the tidal grasp, broken hull plates, twisted iron, and the pervasive gloom of old decay. Here, the singing was no longer a hum. It was a physical force, vibrating through the water itself. It was agonizing, trying to drive the breath from my lungs and fill my consciousness with the paralyzing dread of eternal cold. Then I saw them, the drowned army. They were exactly as they appeared in my hallucination, standing perfectly upright against the ferocious undercurrent, unmoving sentinels. Thomas, my grandfather, stood perhaps 10 feet away, encased in the water's terrible stillness. His eyes reflected the light of my lamp, sad and deep. I saw Silas Thorne, the original sentinel, his hand still clutching the impossible, heavy ballast. I floated toward them, the safety line forgotten. My mind was reeling, recognizing the impossibility of this. Reflective thought. Reality is a consensus, a fragile agreement among those who live above the surface. Below this depth, in this timeless dark, the consensus dissolves. Everything is possible, everything is true, and everything is waiting. The river was speaking to me, not in words, but in pure, overwhelming emotion. Give yourself. Join the ranks. The structure weakens. We demand the replacement. I shook my head violently against the pressure. I signaled no with my hands. As the current tried to push me into the formation, into the final, waiting gap, my light slipped downward, past the boots of the sentinels. There, where the trench dropped off into absolute, crushing blackness, was the Kthalos. It was magnificent in its horror, a swirling vortex, radiating anti-light, pulsing with a deep, consuming rhythm. It was the source of the magnetic pull, the reason the 7 victims had walked so calmly into the bar. It was the pure, distilled essence of the ancient void. I realized the drowned army wasn't just holding it back. They were trapped, forced into this eternal, freezing vigil by the blood bargain. Their sacrifice was perpetual servitude. Suddenly, A new figure appeared at the very edge of my vision. It was not a soldier or a sailor. It was a smaller, older shape, wrapped in the traditional cedar bark cape of the coastal tribes. This figure had eyes that were ancient, glowing faintly with a cold, pale light. The indigenous spirit did not speak through sound, but through immediate, clean transmission of thought, overriding the terror of the abyss. The sacrifice is not required. The thought resonated, piercing the noise of the Kthalos and the singing of the army. The bargain was fear. The binding is memory. This was the pivotal speculative concept, the guidance. The drowned army, in their moment of terror, chose to sacrifice themselves, binding the entity with their life force. But the ancient spirit showed me the deeper, indigenous way. The Kthalos feeds on isolation and forgetfulness. It thrives when the world above ignores the history and the names of the lost. The sentinel's duty wasn't to die and join the wall. It was to live and remember. Remember their names. Sing their honor. The strength of the barrier is the strength of the living memory, the spirit transmitted. Break the pattern of sacrifice. Restore the memory. I looked at Thomas, my grandfather. The absolute exhaustion in his waterlogged face confirmed the truth. They were tired of guarding. They needed the living to take over the primary duty, commemoration. I grasped the meaning instantly. The annual memorial, the continued reading of the names, the cultural honoring. This was the true maintenance of the spiritual barrier. The entity was only able to call the descendants when the memory of the tidal grasp and its lost souls faded into official history, leaving gaps in the defense. I turned my back on the yawning blackness of the Kthalos and kicked upward, my lungs burning, the jet amulet hot against my chest. I had my path. I breached the surface gasping, pulling myself onto the slimy concrete pier, the sounds of the night, the buoys, the distant surf, the foghorns, returning with deafening clarity. The cold was immense, but the singing was receding. I had made contact, I had received the new instruction, and I was alive. I sat shivering on the edge of the pier, peeling off the heavy, water-saturated gear. The sheer, psychic weight of the deep had been replaced by the mundane, physical weight of my dry suit and tanks. It was 12:15 a.m., August 6th. I had faced the abyss and returned, bearing not a curse, but a heavy, vital responsibility. The immediate terror had passed, but the lingering psychological shock was profound. I understood now that I wasn't just fighting a ghost or a localized spook. I was fighting cosmic amnesia. The Kthalos was literally the enemy of memory. The first thing I did when I got home was call Dr. Sarah Mills. It was 1:30 a.m., but I knew she would answer. "Dr. Mills," I said, my voice hoarse, "I need every single name. Every passenger, every crew member, every person who died on the tidal grasp in 1894. I need the full, documented roster, and I need it by noon." She didn't ask why the urgency. She heard the sheer certainty in my voice. She promised the list. The next call was to Antoine Brossard. I told him about the singing, the depth, and the need for a countersong. Antoine, the indigenous spirits, showed me this. We don't beat the darkness with silence or sacrifice. We beat it with noise, with life, with remembrance. Your song is the key. Antoine, too, recognized the profound shift in my tone. He agreed to meet immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, the operation became my entire life. I had to pivot the entire family curse, the existential thread of the Kthalos, into a massive public history project. It was the only way to establish the living anchor. I collaborated openly with Dr. Mills. We presented a proposal to the Astoria City Council, framing the project as a necessary historical reconciliation, a major effort to finally, formally acknowledge the full tragedy of the tidal grasp and the dozens of lives that had been previously left uncounted or forgotten in the rushed records of the 19th century. Grounding fact: historical events involving massive loss of life often rely on public commemoration to achieve closure and societal integration. My argument, framed for the academics, was that the collective denial of the full scope of the 1894 disaster was creating a historical void, manifesting in the recent, mysterious drownings. This explanation was plausible enough for the rational world to accept. I couldn't tell them that if we didn't remember, an ancient entity of pure dread would swallow the coastline. The resistance was minimal. The recent, unexplained disappearances had spooked the entire community. People were desperate for answers, even if the answer was just, "We need to remember the dead better." We scheduled the first annual Sentinels Memorial Service, renamed simply the Tidal Grasp Memorial, for exactly 1 year after the night of my descent, August 5, 1990. Antoine worked feverishly, refining his composition. He merged the old Creole laments with the powerful, resonant drum rhythms of the indigenous music he studied, creating a piece that was both deeply mournful and fiercely defiant. He called it the tide's defiance. The atmosphere, however, remained oppressive. The river still felt heavy. I still felt the faint, magnetic pull toward the current whenever I was near marker zero. The Kthalos was testing the limits of my commitment. It was a constant psychological battle. I had begun to understand that the drowned army, the Sentinels, were still performing their duty. They were the physical lock on the abyss, forged in sacrifice. My job was to maintain the metaphysical key, the collective, living memory. One evening, I visited Alara. She didn't ask what I had seen down in the dark. She just looked at the jet amulet, which had cooled to a normal temperature, and nodded slowly. "You listen to the old voice," she stated, satisfied. "The Kthalos feeds on the absence of name. You are giving the names back to the light." She explained that the initial bargain was flawed because it relied on perpetual sacrifice. The indigenous wisdom, she said, was older, recognizing that binding evil is impossible. You must instead starve it. The abyss starves when the human connection to history and bloodline is robust and celebrated. Speculative concept. The memorial service wasn't just symbolic. It was an annual, collective ritual of boundary maintenance, literally projecting psychic energy into the physical river channel. Every named soul acted as a tiny, radiant point of light, reinforcing the barrier that Silas Thorne and Thomas Thorne had physically built with their bodies. August 5, 1990, arrived. The fog was there, but it was thinner, almost translucent. Hundreds of people gathered on the docks near Marker Zero. Scholars, locals, descendants of the tidal grasp victims, and the curious. The ceremony was simple. Dr. Mills spoke about historical integrity. I, as a representative of the Port Authority and a descendant, spoke about community and legacy. Then came the music. Antoine Brossard and his ensemble stood on the pier. As the sun began to set, painting the turbulent water in shades of bruised purple and orange, they began to play the tide's defiance. It was powerful, heartbreaking, and insistent. As the music peaked, I stepped forward to the microphone, holding the carefully compiled list of the tidal grasp victims. I started reading. I didn't just read names. I read their full names, their occupations, their ages. I read Silas Thorne. I read my grandfather, Thomas Thorne, adding his name to the memorial, formally acknowledging his intentional, sacrificial passing. I read all 7 names of the recent victims: Clara Vance, O'Malley, Phelan, the list the river had tried to reclaim. As the last name left my lips, a peculiar thing happened. The atmosphere lifted. The heavy dread that had clung to the coastline for a year simply dispersed. I felt a palpable release of tension, a spiritual exhalation coming from the deep bar channel itself. The water still churned, but the underlying hum, the commanding song of the abyss, had vanished. The service was a success, a moment of profound, shared catharsis. But for me, it was more. It was the creation of the first true defense against the Kthalos. I had kept my promise to the spirit guide and reinforced the barrier without drowning. The Tidal Grasp Memorial Service became an annual institution. It was a commitment I had made to the drowned army, to the spirit guide, and most importantly, to the sanctity of the world above the waves. Every August 5th, regardless of the weather, we gathered at Marker Zero. Dr. Mills ensured the event had academic weight, attracting historians and students. Antoine Brossard's composition, The Tide's Defiance, became the anthem of the coast, sung fiercely every year. And I, Elias Thorne, stood at the podium, reading the names, ensuring that the collective memory remained sharp and bright. The change was immediate and profound. The cluster of mysterious disappearances ended. The river still claimed lives. The bar is eternally treacherous, but the victims were random, accidental, and their bodies, crucially, were recovered. The selective, targeted calling of the descendants ceased entirely. The Sentinel line had been successfully redirected from perpetual death to perpetual remembrance. 35 years passed. It is now the present day. I am no longer the young, haunted Marine Patrol officer. My beard is gray, my joints ache with the coastal damp, and I retired from the patrol a decade ago. But my watch has not ended. I still live near the coast. I still listen to the hum of the buoys. And I still feel the river. Only now, it feels less like a predator and more like a deeply respected, heavily guarded neighbor. The Kthalos is still there. Speculative concept. It is not dead. It is merely slumbering, perpetually starved by the continuous influx of living human connection and historical acknowledgement. The barrier holds. The responsibility, however, is generational. The nature of the Kthalos means that the defense must be organic, tied to the bloodlines that were originally marked for sacrifice. I needed a successor, a younger, brighter sentinel to maintain the living anchor when my voice eventually fails. I found that successor not in my own children, who moved inland, finding the coast too dreary, but in my cousin's granddaughter, Celeste Thorne. Celeste grew up hearing the stories, absorbing the folklore from Alara before she passed. She is now a young environmentalist, deeply connected to the estuary. She doesn't see ghosts, but she feels the history of the water. She understands the weight of the names. I brought her to Marker Zero one afternoon, not long after her graduation. The wind was whipping, and the bar was displaying its eternal, churning power. "I need you to listen to the bar, Celeste," I told her, my voice gravelly. "It is chaos, yes. But beneath the chaos, there is a terrible stillness. That stillness is guarded by the memory of the dead. Your ancestors bought us peace with their lives, but we must pay the ongoing maintenance fee with our vigilance." I passed her the worn, polished jet amulet. It was warm from years of contact with my own skin. "The job isn't to look for a body," I explained. "The job is to make sure every name on that list, every year, is read with conviction. The day we forget one, the day the service becomes a shallow obligation, is the day the river starts calling again." Celeste understood. She didn't look afraid. She looked determined. She represented the new way, the sentinel who walks the earth and guards the deep by maintaining the light of memory. I have continued to organize the annual memorial, working with Celeste to ensure its longevity. The roster of the lost has now become a permanent monument near the bar entrance, a heavy slate tablet etched with every name, a physical acknowledgement that the community will never forget the price paid here. This year, August 5th, was my turn to pass the physical torch. I stood beside Celeste at the podium. I introduced her, emphasizing her historical connection and her commitment to the community. As the music faded, Celeste stepped forward, holding the list I used to hold. She looked out over the crowd, over the gray, unforgiving water, and began to read. Her voice was strong, young, and utterly clear. Hearing my ancestor's name, Silas Thorne, spoken by her, felt like hearing it for the first time. A fresh investment in the barrier. Reflective thought. The true nature of this horror wasn't the monster in the abyss, but the sheer, crushing weight of generational trauma and the silence we use to cover it. The victory is not in eliminating the horror, but in transforming silence into sound and dread into duty. I am old now, and the memory of the cold, the darkness, and the perfect terror of the Kthalos is receding, becoming a story I tell myself, rather than a physical certainty. But I know the abyss still waits. I know that Thomas and Silas and the drowned army still stand vigil in the crushing depth, awaiting the annual ceremony. My role is shifting from active sentinel to living testament, ensuring Celeste carries on the duty of remembrance. I watch her read the names, feeling the ancient, collective sigh of the river, quieted by the power of the living world. The peace is fragile, but it is real. The sentinels are finally free, not from their post, but from the need for further blood sacrifice. Their duty is now woven into the history of the land, sustained by the memory of the living. The Tidal Grasp Memorial Service became an annual institution. It was a commitment I had made to the drowned army, to the spirit guide, and most importantly, to the sanctity of the world above the waves. Every August 5th, regardless of the weather, we gathered at Marker Zero. Dr. Mills ensured the event had academic weight, attracting historians and students. Antoine Brossard's composition, The Tide's Defiance, became the anthem of the coast, sung fiercely every year. And I, Elias Thorne, stood at the podium, reading the names, ensuring that the collective memory remained sharp and bright. The change was immediate and profound. The cluster of mysterious disappearances ended. The river still claimed lives. The bar is eternally treacherous, but the victims were random, accidental, and their bodies, crucially, were recovered. The selective, targeted calling of the descendants ceased entirely. The Sentinel line had been successfully redirected from perpetual death to perpetual remembrance. 35 years passed. It is now the present day. I am no longer the young, haunted Marine Patrol officer. My beard is gray, my joints ache with the coastal damp, and I retired from the patrol a decade ago. But my watch has not ended. I still live near the coast. I still listen to the hum of the buoys. And I still feel the river. Only now, it feels less like a predator and more like a deeply respected, heavily guarded neighbor. The Kthalos is still there. Speculative concept. It is not dead. It is merely slumbering, perpetually starved by the continuous influx of living human connection and historical acknowledgement. The barrier holds. The responsibility, however, is generational. The nature of the Kthalos means that the defense must be organic, tied to the bloodlines that were originally marked for sacrifice. I needed a successor, a younger, brighter sentinel to maintain the living anchor when my voice eventually fails. I found that successor not in my own children, who moved inland, finding the coast too dreary, but in my cousin's granddaughter, Celeste Thorne. Celeste grew up hearing the stories, absorbing the folklore from Alara before she passed. She is now a young environmentalist, deeply connected to the estuary. She understands the weight of the names. I brought her to Marker Zero one afternoon, not long after her graduation. The wind was whipping, and the bar was displaying its eternal, churning power. "I need you to listen to the bar, Celeste," I told her, my voice gravelly. "It is chaos, yes, but beneath the chaos, there is a terrible stillness. That stillness is guarded by the memory of the dead. Your ancestors bought us peace with their lives, but we must pay the ongoing maintenance fee with our vigilance." I passed her the worn, polished jet amulet. It was warm from years of contact with my own skin. "The job isn't to look for a body," I explained. "The job is to make sure every name on that list, every year, is read with conviction. The day we forget one, the day the service becomes a shallow obligation, is the day the river starts calling again. Celeste understood. She didn't look afraid. She looked determined. She represented the new way, the sentinel who walks the earth and guards the deep by maintaining the light of memory. I have continued to organize the annual memorial, working with Celeste to ensure its longevity. The roster of the lost has now become a permanent monument near the bar entrance, a heavy slate tablet etched with every name, a physical acknowledgement that the community will never forget the price paid here. This year, August 5th, was my turn to pass the physical torch. I stood beside Celeste at the podium. I introduced her, emphasizing her historical connection and her commitment to the community. As the music faded, Celeste stepped forward, holding the list I used to hold. She looked out over the crowd, over the gray, unforgiving water, and began to read. Her voice was strong, young, and utterly clear. Hearing my ancestor's name, Silas Thorne, spoken by her, felt like hearing it for the first time. A fresh investment in the barrier. Reflective thought. The true nature of this horror wasn't the monster in the abyss, but the sheer, crushing weight of generational trauma and the silence we use to cover it. The victory is not in eliminating the horror, but in transforming silence into sound and dread into duty. I am old now, and the memory of the cold, the darkness, and the perfect terror of the Kthalos is receding, becoming a story I tell myself, rather than a physical certainty. But I know the abyss still waits. I know that Thomas and Silas and the drowned army still stand vigil in the crushing depth, awaiting the annual ceremony. My role is shifting from active sentinel to living testament, ensuring Celeste carries on the duty of remembrance. I watch her read the names, feeling the ancient, collective sigh of the river, quieted by the power of the living world. The sentinels are finally free, not from their post, but from the need for further blood sacrifice. Their duty is now woven into the history of the land, sustained by the memory of the living. The shift in responsibility felt like shedding a lead weight I hadn't realized I was carrying for decades. When Celeste finished the reading, strong, clear, honoring every soul, she turned and handed me the list, not as a burden, but as a sacred text. The memorial dispersed slowly. The people walked away, talking of the weather, of the history, of the power of the Columbia River Bar. For them, it was an emotional, historical moment. For Celeste and me, it was the closing of a lock on a subterranean vault. I stayed until the last of the light bled out of the sky, watching the tide begin its relentless, churning outward pull. The river was silent, but it was a deep, watchful silence, the silence of a massive, resting sentinel. Grounding fact: coastal erosion, especially around large jetties and river bars, is a continuous, geological process that subtly alters the landscape and the hydrodynamics year after year. I recognized that even if the spiritual defense was sound, the physical barrier, the sediment, the rock, the wreckage the drowned army clung to, was slowly decaying. This fact anchors the perpetual need for vigilance. I felt a faint flicker of Thomas's presence, not in a vision this time, but as a profound sense of relief washing over the water. My grandfather and Silas and all the others were still bound, but their sacrifice now had meaning beyond endless, cold servitude. They were finally, truly honored. I looked at Celeste. She was staring out at the channel entrance, her expression focused, not fearful. "It's quiet tonight, Elias," she observed. "It is," I agreed. "The memory holds." We walked back toward the car, leaving marker 0 to the oncoming night. The jet amulet in my pocket was still warm, a constant reminder of the fight, but I knew its duty had shifted from protection to inheritance. The nature of the Kthalos is eternal. It is the concept of oblivion given physical mass. My victory was never about elimination. It was about strategic, perpetual containment. My greatest fear, The shadow that still lurks in the corners of my old age is complacency. If the next generation, Celeste's descendants, find the memorial ceremony tiresome, if they treat the reading of the names as a mere formality, the gaps will reappear. The abyss will listen, waiting for the precise moment when the living memory weakens. Reflective thought. True victory against ancient evil is not a single, dramatic confrontation. It is the quiet, continuous effort to choose light over darkness, connection over isolation, year after year, until time itself absorbs the monster. Our vigilance is the true sentinel. I sit now, writing these words, detailing the history not just for a record, but as part of the ongoing defense. I transmit this story into the void, into the static, ensuring the terrifying truth of the Kthalos remains alive in the public consciousness, even if cloaked in folklore and dread. Celeste is preparing for next year's service. She found a new set of archived photos of the tidal grasp victims. More detail, more life to attach to the names. She understands that the barrier must be reinforced not just with conviction, but with renewed dedication to the full humanity of the lost. The wind howls outside my window tonight, and I hear the low, deep resonance of the navigational buoy. It sounds like a heartbeat, a regular, steady beat, maintained by the careful, intentional memory of the living. The river is quiet. The drowned army rests, their posts secured by the sound of human voices remembering their sacrifice. And I, the last of the old sentinels, watch the morning light begin to break over the dark Pacific, listening for any shift in the current, any whisper of the command that might signal the memory is failing. But for tonight, the darkness is contained. The moment the responsibility truly left my hands, I felt a peculiar sensation, not relief from the danger, but an immense, heavy loneliness. For 35 years, I had been tethered to the abyss, not just by blood, but by direct, psychic communication. Now, that communication was muted, redirected toward Celeste. I was free to be simply Elias Thorne, retired Marine Patrol, an old man by the sea, rather than the besieged sentinel. But the peace was unsettling. I spent the autumn walking the beach near Marker Zero, watching the immense cycles of the tide. I collected fragments of driftwood and smooth glass, tangible proof that the sea still offered up small pieces of the past, rather than swallowing the future whole. The permanent marker we erected for the tidal grasp victims stands firm against the constant battering of the wind and salt spray, a black slab of basalt that defies the river's efforts to erase history. Grounding fact: studies in mnemonic techniques confirm that linking factual data, like names and dates, to emotional, sensory, or geographical anchors significantly improves retention across generations. Our annual service, the music, the place, the collective sadness and resolve, is a perfect, engineered mnemonic defense mechanism. One recent evening, Celeste came by. She was carrying a heavy leather-bound folder. "I found something," she said, laying it on my table. An old oral history from a Chinook elder, recorded in the 1920s. They talk about the Kthalos too, but they called it the soul drinker. She pointed to a passage translated from the indigenous language. It described how the entity beneath the bar was held not by force, but by the continuous attention of the people. They used to conduct their own ceremonies near the jetty centuries ago, singing, drumming, telling the stories of those who went into the water. This confirmed the speculative concept I had learned in the dive. The blood bargain was a panicked, colonial-era imitation of an ancient, successful method of containment. Silas and his comrades had copied the format, the sacrifice, without understanding the content, the remembrance. "We're doing the right thing, Elias," Celeste said, her voice low. "We are restoring the original balance." I nodded, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction. The curse was broken not by power, but by humility and deep listening. Listening to the river, listening to the ancestors, and listening to the voices that preceded the wreck. But I have one final lesson I must impart to Celeste, one that keeps me awake on the stormiest nights. I told her about the gaps in the drowned army's ranks, the places where the 7 recent victims should have stood. Celeste, when I saw them, I saw their places empty. That means their souls are not part of the Sentinel Wall. The river took them before they could make the voluntary choice, or perhaps before the full mechanism of the abyss could claim them entirely. They are lost, not guarded. But the service honors them too, she insisted. Yes, but what happened to their souls? I asked, looking her straight in the eye. The drowned army is trapped, but bound. The 7 victims were simply claimed, vanished into the abyss before the barrier could be reinforced. Did they become part of the Kthalos itself? Or do they drift in the deep, a second, more permanent tragedy? I have never been able to answer that. And I know the abyss never gives back what it truly claims. Now, as I listen to the wind die down and the house settles around me, I realize that the most terrifying part of the horror is not the fear of the deep, but the fear of the morning, when the sun rises and we pretend the darkness doesn't matter. We must never pretend. The sun is coming up over the coast now, pulling the heavy curtains of fog away from the window. The light doesn't bring absolute peace, just clarity. I hear the distant, repetitive groan of the buoy, the steady rhythm of the bar. It is a peaceful sound, but underneath it, I still detect the ghost of the singing. It is a quiet morning. The duty has been fulfilled. The memory holds. And the abyss, for now, is silent. The light is a pale, silver intrusion now, forcing the shadows back into the deepest corners of the room. The oppressive weight of the night lifts, replaced by the mundane chill of a Pacific Northwest morning. You can hear the distant cry of the gulls, thin and reedy, a sound that promises the world is still here, still turning, still bathed in the fragile warmth of the sun. The nightmare recedes, folding back into the water from whence it came. I sit here, old and watchful, feeling the heavy, comfortable weight of Alara's jet amulet in my palm. The memory of the black, lightless trench, the perfect stillness of the drowned army, and the gravitational pull of the Kthalos, it all feels like a dream now, a story told in the darkness. But the truth is anchored in the light of day, inscribed on a cold basalt slab near the water's edge.